welcome to this episode of China Edge brought to you by the SupChina team. I'm your host, Lizzie, an MIT-trained economist turned journalist at Wall Street TV who covers China and its relation to the world. Here at China Edge, we go beyond the headlines and guide you, our audience, through the jungle of Chinese regulations. We go deep into industry trends and identify challenges and opportunities in the Chinese market. Earlier this month, a hacker claimed to have obtained a trove of personal data from Shanghai police on over 1 billion Chinese citizens. Joining me today is Wall Street Journal reporter Karen Hao, who has been covering the Shanghai data breach. Thank you, Karen, for being here with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Lizzie.
So Karen, can you first help us understand the theft of the Shanghai police database? How did it actually happen? How much data is compromised? And what are the potential security risks, as you can see at this point?
Yeah, so early in July, there started being this post that was circulating on social media, and it was essentially a screenshot of some anonymous user on a cybercrime forum alleging that they were selling nearly 1 billion Chinese citizens' information stolen from the Shanghai police. And when at the Journal, we were trying to verify what was happening because it just seemed so fantastical that it didn't seem real. And so we ended up calling some of the people that were in this alleged database and verifying the authenticity of some of the records of information. And so basically, for a while, what we knew was that it did indeed come from the Shanghai police. It did indeed contain some real information. And there was this one document in the database in particular that seemed to be a master file of essentially all of the citizens in China. That included their name, their government ID, their birthday, their location of birth. And there's also another file that had even more sensitive information that was essentially a record of all of the police cases. So detailed cases of people calling the Shanghai police saying things like, on this and this day, I lost my phone, or on this and this day, I was defrauded of X amount of money. And even more sensitive things like alleged rape or alleged domestic abuse. And at this point, we're pretty confident, based on how much information has been coming out from cybersecurity researchers, that the database is real. And what seems to have happened is that essentially the Shanghai police, they were hosting their data on an Alibaba cloud. They were using Alibaba Cloud to host this. And it's not clear what happened or who did what, but that database was itself secured. But there was a dashboard that was used to access the database that was just publicly accessible on the internet without any password for over a year. And so at any point during that year, it could have been accessed multiple times actually by many different groups. And we only discovered it because one of them decided to sell it on a cybercrime forum. And shortly after it went up for sale and started getting international attention, that's when the database was finally cut off from public access.
Right, so that the second part you talk about is kind of amazing to us. I mean, so the stolen database has been stored on Alibaba's cloud, basically not with proper tech, without basic security features. So do we have any gauge of how prevalent issues like this are?
It's actually shockingly prevalent globally, not just within China. So when I was speaking with cybersecurity researchers, they said that databases without passwords is a really common thing. And in fact, these researchers, the reason why they found the database and this security flaw in the first place is because they built their entire businesses around scanning for these types of databases. And then sometimes they have partnerships with certain clients to notify them when their database is unsecured. But in terms of estimates for how bad this is or how prevalent this is, China actually tops the number of databases, tens of thousands of databases that it has open and unsecured in this way online. And there are over 700 terabytes of data based on their last count of how much citizen data is just floating out there.
Right, and what's so interesting is the breach actually tells us more about the nature and volume of the data the Chinese government is collecting about its citizens. I wonder if you can sort of walk us through some of the lessons on Chinese surveillance. Are there new things that we don't know previously?
I don't know that there are dramatically new things that we didn't know, but it definitely confirmed a lot of the things that had been reported, but didn't have like real evidence of looking at a database and confirming that this was true. So one of the things that I was very surprised by in this database is it doesn't just have these police files, which makes sense. It's a police database. It also had a document that was just, it seems like food delivery data. And it was clearly from a private company that runs like a food delivery app or some kind of delivery app. And this had been sort of talked about in local Chinese media that the Shanghai government had announced some kind of integrated data platform where they were pulling in data from not just state agencies, but also from private companies that offer these services. But it was just really striking to see that directly in the database because you I don't know, sometimes people will say, you know, companies will announce or agencies will announce that they have this integrated data platform, but behind the scenes, it's actually still like really convoluted, but it was all just centralized and in this easy to read format. And then in one fell swoop, essentially it allowed anyone to just walk in and take all of it.
Right, right. So that's quite surprising actually to a lot of people. I wanted to come back to the Alibaba cloud service provider bit a little bit. So which companies are the largest cloud service providers in China, and what do we know about their business models, their relative competitiveness? Who are the biggest players in this space?
Yeah, I think the top three cloud providers in China are Alibaba, Huawei, and Tencent. And Alibaba specifically is known to support a lot of government agencies and do this kind of like public government cloud service. Um, and Alibaba is also, they also dominate. They're the leading player, although it is sort of different from the US market in that there is quite a lot of players and they each have somewhat uh, comparable shares of the market. But in terms of like what could have happened, I mean, it doesn't look good for Alibaba. We can't say that it was Alibaba that might have messed up the security of this database. But what we can say is that after the researchers discovered that this database was essentially left out in the open through this dashboard for over a year, they also, like the metadata on this database showed that the software that they were using was so outdated that it didn't even have the ability to add a password. And in fact, there were about a dozen other Alibaba databases that had sort of the same exact pattern, all left open for over, almost all of them left open for over a year, all using sort of the same outdated software. And additionally, just having some other strange cybersecurity practices that are not considered best practice in industry for how to actually make sure things are secure. So yeah, it doesn't look good in that sense for the company.
Hi, this is Lizzie, host of the China Edge show. We have prepared both English and Chinese subtitles for the show. You can turn on subtitles by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your YouTube video. Click on the gear icon and select from one of the three languages: English, Chinese Simplified, and Chinese Traditional. 大家好，这里是李琦。在 China Edge 节目中，我们为您准备了中英双语字幕，请您按照屏幕上的指示打开齿轮图标，选择需要的语言，然后选择 CC 按钮，打开字幕，这样就可以看到有字幕的节目了。I wonder if you can sort of elaborate a little more on that. What have you learned from this episode, and how should we think about the tension between, regime security versus data security?
Yeah, so what's really interesting, I mean, over the last 10 years, the Chinese government has been really intent on protecting data security, on protecting and locking down China's cyberspace. And that really kicked off because in 2013 of the revelations that former NSA contractor Edward Snowden gave that were that the NSA had successfully sort of hacked into the deep into the backbone of the Chinese internet, and they were collecting tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of citizens' data, Chinese citizens' data. And so in that moment when Xi Jinping was like newly elected, it really spooked him and the rest of the senior government officials into realizing that data security is national security. It is a national security issue to be able to have foreign intelligence sort of freely collecting all of this data, especially now that we have things like AI techniques that can extract even more insight from that data. But at the same time, what we've seen with this growing cybersecurity regime is this extreme expansion of surveillance across the country as well. So not only is the government trying to protect the data from leaving the country, it's also concentrating all of that data into essentially single points of failure. And so what I kind of realized from reporting this story is that there's just this direct conflict between these two projects that the government has that are both intended to protect the security of the country. Like, the government argues that surveillance is meant to increase the social stability of the country and make sure that crime and terrorism can be rooted out very quickly. So essentially, I feel like the reporting kind of bears out that the government has sort of created their own vulnerability in data security, in that they are amassing all of this data from state agencies, from private companies, all extremely sensitive because they are police databases. That is sort of the most sensitive form of information. And after this leak came out, we actually started looking at what other Chinese citizens' data might be floating around in these same cybercrime forums. And we found dozens of other databases or dozens of other posts that were allegedly selling Chinese data, and we went ahead and verified 4 of them that were all pretty much couldn't have come from a source that wasn't the government, because it had things like government IDs and other types of information that only government agencies would have. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how the government actually reacts to this, because it's essentially demonstrated. It should be a wake-up call. It's essentially demonstrated how much in opposition these two projects have been.
If you enjoy our discussions here, I'm sure you would find value in our new powerful marketplace tool for investors, also called China Edge. It tracks, distills, and analyzes both Chinese language and English language materials about Chinese companies, business leaders, and government entities, and reviews the often hidden links between them. For our YouTube viewers, we are offering a limited time 50% discount. Just go to the link you see on the screen and use the code EDGE50. Also, sign up for the China Edge newsletter. It's a daily 2-minute rundown of China business news you don't want to miss. The link is right here on the screen. You can also click on the link in the video's description section to get your complimentary subscription today.